It was a strange time, the early 1970s, a kind of gray hangover from the 60s. In Rochester, New York, like in many American cities, there was a feeling that things weren't as safe as they used to. The world felt bigger and scarier. And then, the disappearances started. 3 young girls vanished. 3 young girls found murdered. The facts were brutal and simple. But the pattern, the one that gave the case its chilling name, was anything but. The Alphabet Murders. The Rochester Double-Initial Murders. The question that has haunted investigators, journalists, and the community for over 50 years is a straightforward one. Was it all the work of one person? Did a single, methodical killer stalk the streets of Rochester, choosing his victims based on a horrifyingly personal set of rules? Or was it something else? A string of terrible, unrelated tragedies forced into a pattern by fear and a desperate need for answers. The truth is, nobody knows for sure. But the evidence, the suspects, and the lingering questions tell a story of a city gripped by a mystery that refuses to die. It began with Carmen Colón. She was 10 years old. On November 16, 1971, she went to the pharmacy to pick up a prescription for her grandfather. A simple errand she'd probably done before, but she never came back. Panic set in for her family. A search began. For 2 days, there was nothing. Just the silence of a missing child. Then, a couple of teenagers driving down a remote road in the town of Churchville saw something in a ditch. It was Carmen. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The community was horrified. A child murdered was a nightmare scenario. Police started their investigation, but they had very little to go on. There were no witnesses to her abduction. The crime scene, an open ditch, offered few clues. It was a terrible isolated crime, or so everyone thought. For nearly a year and a half, the city of Rochester lived with the unresolved horror of Carmen's murder. Life went on, as it does, but the fear was there, a low hum beneath the surface. Then, on April 26, 1973, it happened again. Wanda Walkowicz was 11 years old. She had brown hair and a bright smile. She went to the grocery store for her mother. It was just after 5 p.m. She bought a few things, mostly sandwich items. She was seen leaving the store, and then she was gone. Just like Carmen, she vanished into thin air. The city held its breath. Another missing girl. It felt sickeningly familiar. This time, the search was frantic. Police and volunteers scoured the area. The next morning, a state trooper found her. She was on the side of an off-ramp on Route 104 in the town of Webster. Like Carmen, she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. She was still wearing the coat she had on when she disappeared. The killer had taken her belt. This is when the pattern began to emerge. Not just in the minds of the public, but for the investigators working the case. 2 young girls, similar age, similar appearance, abducted while running an errand, murdered in the same way, dumped in a different town, and then someone noticed the initials. Carmen Colón found in Churchville, CC Wanda Walkowicz found in Webster. WW, it was a chilling coincidence. Too chilling. The media picked up on it. The police couldn't ignore it. The idea of the double-initial killer was born. The city was officially in the grip of a serial killer panic. Police formed a massive task force, pulling in detectives from multiple departments. They worked around the clock, chasing down leads, interviewing hundreds of people. They looked at known sex offenders. They looked at anyone with a suspicious history. But they kept hitting dead ends. The killer was a ghost. He left behind his victims, but almost nothing of himself. Then, 7 months later, the ghost struck again. On November 26, 1973, Michelle Maenza disappeared. She was 11 years old. She was last seen walking home from school. Her path was a familiar one, just a few blocks, but she never made it to her front door. The pattern was now a terrifyingly predictable script. A young girl vanishes, a frantic search ensues, the community waits in dread. 2 days later, Michelle's body was found. A motorist spotted her in a ditch along a rural road in the town of Macedon. The details were grimly the same. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The cause of death, the method of disposal, the victim's profile, it all matched. And the initials, Michelle Maenza, Macedon, MM. The pattern was complete. 3 victims. CCWWMM, the alphabet killer, was no longer a theory. In the public mind, he was real. So, let's look at the argument for a single killer. It's powerful. You can't just dismiss the connections as random chance. The similarities are too numerous and too specific. First, you have the victims themselves. Carmen, Wanda, and Michelle were all pre-pubescent girls, around 10 or 11 years old. They all had similar physical characteristics, often described as petite with brown hair. This is what profilers call a victim type. Serial predators often have a very specific type of person they target, one that fits a fantasy they're trying to fulfill. The chances of 3 separate killers operating in the same area over a 2-year period, all independently choosing to target the exact same type of victim, are slim. It points toward one person with a single dark obsession. Then there's the method of abduction. All 3 girls were taken in broad daylight from public, seemingly safe places while they were on their own. They were running errands, or walking home from school. These are crimes of opportunity, but they require a certain kind of predator. Someone who can approach a child, gain their trust, or overpower them quickly, and get them into a vehicle without creating a scene. This suggests a killer who is comfortable and confident, perhaps someone who appears non-threatening. Maybe a person in a uniform, or someone who used a ruse, like asking for help finding a lost puppy. For 3 different killers to use a similar successful tactic is possible, but less likely than one killer perfecting his method. The cause of death is another strong link. All 3 girls were strangled. This is a very personal, hands-on method of killing. It's not distant like a shooting, it's intimate and requires physical power and control. While the specifics varied slightly, some reports suggest a ligature was used in one case while manual strangulation was used in others. The core act of strangulation is a consistent signature. It often points to a killer who is motivated by a need for power and domination over their victim. And of course, the disposal of the bodies. This is one of the most compelling parts of the pattern. The killer didn't bury them, he didn't try to hide them in a deep remote forest. He left them in roadside ditches or on embankments in neighboring towns. They were meant to be found. This act of leaving the bodies in a semi-public place can be a taunt to the police. It's a display of arrogance. The killer is saying, "You can't catch me." For 3 separate murderers to choose the same specific, risky method of disposal seems highly unlikely. The most famous connection is the alliterative initials: Carmen Colón in Churchville, Wanda Walkowicz in Webster, Michelle Maenza in Macedon. On the surface, this looks like the calling card of a very clever, very twisted killer. It's the kind of thing that makes a case infamous. It feels intentional, a signature designed to terrorize the public and baffle the police. It creates a narrative, a sense of a game being played. But the strongest physical evidence linking the 3 murders is much less sensational than the initials. It's cat hair. Forensic analysis at the time was primitive compared to today, but investigators found microscopic evidence. Hairs believed to be from a cat were found on the bodies of all 3 girls. And not just any cat hair. The hairs were similar enough in composition to suggest they could have come from the same animal. This is a powerful piece of trace evidence. It means the killer likely had a cat, or at least spent a significant amount of time in a place where a cat lived. The victims did not have cats of their own. For all 3 girls to have independently come into contact with the same source of cat hair is an astronomical coincidence. This evidence, more than anything else, points to a single location where the killer took his victims, or a single vehicle he used to transport them. It points to a single man. So, the case for a single killer is strong. The victimology, the abduction method, the cause of death, the disposal sites, the alliterative initials, and the crucial cat hair evidence all weave together to form a convincing picture of a lone serial predator working his way through the Rochester area. The FBI profilers who looked at the case believed it was the work of one person. The police task force operated under that assumption. It seems to be the most logical conclusion. But what if it isn't? What if the neat, terrifying pattern is an illusion? The argument against a single killer, or at least for the possibility of coincidence, is also worth considering. It requires us to look at the evidence with a more skeptical eye. Let's start with the most famous part of the pattern, the initials. CC, WWMM. It's catchy, it makes a great headline, but is it real, or do we just want it to be? Rochester is a city surrounded by dozens of towns and villages. Many of them start with common letters. There's a Chile, a Clarkson, and a Churchville. There's a Webster and a Walworth. There's a Macedon, a Mendon, and a Marion. Think about it this way. After the murder of Wanda Walkowicz in Webster, the police and media were already primed for a WWW. But what if she had been found in the town of Penfield, or Parenton, or Pittsford? Would the police have looked for a PP victim? What if her name had been Sarah? The narrative might have collapsed. The theory goes that the double initial pattern is a product of confirmation bias. The police and the public saw a connection between the first 2 cases and then subconsciously or even consciously looked for evidence that fit that pattern in the 3rd case. The killer of Michelle Maenza might have had nothing to do with the first 2 murders, but because his crime was similar, it was folded into the existing narrative. It's also possible the killer of the 3rd victim was a copycat. He read the newspapers, heard the stories about the double initial killer, and decided to mimic the crime, either to throw police off or for his own sick reasons. The pattern, in this view, is not the work of a single mastermind, but a combination of coincidence, media hype, and possibly a copycat crime. It's a compelling idea, but one that's impossible to prove. There are also subtle differences in the crimes themselves. While all three were strangled, the specifics of the sexual assaults were not identical. The ligatures used, or not used, varied. The way the girls' clothing was arranged when they were found had slight differences. A single serial killer usually has a very specific ritual, a script they follow with each victim. While the core elements were the same, a detective looking for reasons to doubt the single killer theory could find enough small inconsistencies to raise questions. Were these variations just the killer evolving his methods, or were they the signatures of different offenders? Even the geography raises questions. While the girls were all from the Rochester area, they were taken from different parts of the city and its suburbs. The dump sites, too, were in different directions from the city center. Churchville is to the west. Webster is to the east. Macedon is further southeast. This isn't the tight, geographically focused hunting ground some serial killers favor. It's a wide area. Again, this doesn't disprove the single killer theory, but it adds a layer of complexity. The lack of a suspect is perhaps the biggest reason to question everything. For over 50 years, no one has ever been charged. If one man committed all three murders, it means he got away with it completely. He either died, moved away, or is still living somewhere, having never killed again in a way that could be linked back to Rochester. That's certainly possible. But it's also possible that police were so focused on finding a single alphabet killer that they overlooked other leads. Maybe they discounted a good suspect for one of the murders because he had a solid alibi for another. The hunt for a single phantom might have allowed two, or even three, separate killers to escape justice. This leads us to the rogues gallery of suspects who have been associated with the case over the decades. None of them have ever been definitively linked, but some are more compelling than others. Perhaps the most famous suspect is Kenneth Bianchi. Before he was known as one of the Hillside Stranglers who terrorized Los Angeles in the late 1970s, Bianchi lived in Rochester. He was there during the time of all three alphabet murders, and what did he do for a living? He drove an ice cream truck. It's a chilling detail. An ice cream man has a legitimate, non-threatening reason to be around children and to know the neighborhoods intimately. Bianchi fit the profile in other ways. He was a sexually motivated killer. He strangled his victims in Los Angeles. When he was finally caught, police in Rochester looked at him hard. They interviewed him about the alphabet murder. He denied any involvement, and he passed a polygraph test, for what that's worth. The methods of the Hillside Strangler cases were also different. He often worked with his cousin Angela Buono, and they typically targeted older women, not young girls. Still, the timing and his presence in Rochester make him an object of intense suspicion. Could the alphabet murders have been his first attempts at killing, before he refined his methods and changed his victim type? It's a question that has never been answered. Another suspect emerged decades later, a man named Joseph Nasso. Nasso was a photographer who was convicted in 2013 for the murders of 4 women in California in the 70s and 90s. His connection to the Rochester case is uncanny. His victims had alliterative initials. For example, he killed a Roxane Ragash. He also killed a Carmen Colón, the same name as the first Rochester victim. The name was spelled differently, but the coincidence is staggering. Nasso kept a list of 10 that detailed rape and murder fantasies, and some of the descriptions matched his known victim. Investigators found that Nasso had lived in Rochester in the years following the alphabet murders. He claimed he wasn't there in the early 70s, but his timeline is murky. Is it possible he passed through Rochester, committed the murders, and then moved on? His double-initial signature makes him a person of interest, but there's no hard evidence placing him in the city at the exact right time. Then there are the local suspects, the ones who never became national names. Early in the investigation, Carmen Colón's uncle was a person of interest. He was the one who was supposed to pick her up, and there were inconsistencies in his story. He was eventually cleared by police, but it shows how the investigation initially focused on those closest to the victims. There was also a local firefighter who committed suicide years later. He was a person of interest in the disappearance and murder of another young girl in the area in 1979. He lived near where one of the alphabet victims was last seen. Could he have been responsible for one or all of the murders? With his death, police lost the chance to ever question him properly. He remains a question mark, a local man who might have been hiding a terrible secret. The problem with all these suspects is the same. There is no physical evidence, no DNA, no confession that ties any of them to the crimes. The cat hair found on the victims is the most tantalizing clue, but without a suspect's cat to compare it to, it's just an interesting but ultimately unhelpful fact. The lack of DNA evidence is a product of the times. In the 1970s, forensic science was not what it is today. Evidence was not always preserved in a way that would allow for modern DNA testing. Over the years, samples from the case have been re-examined, but they are either too degraded or contain no usable suspect DNA. The killer, whether it was one man or three, was lucky. He operated in an era just before the scientific revolution that would have almost certainly led to his capture. So where does that leave us? Did a single killer murder the alphabet victims? The weight of the evidence seems to lean toward yes. The tight victimology, the consistent method of murder and disposal, and especially the cross-contamination of the cat hairs, all create a compelling argument for a single offender. It feels more likely that one person was responsible than it does that three separate, but nearly identical killers were operating in the same city at the same time. The alphabet pattern, while possibly a coincidence, adds another layer that is hard to dismiss entirely. It feels too perfect, too deliberate, but the yes is not a certainty. It's a conclusion based on inference and pattern recognition, not on hard proof. The doubts are real and legitimate. The confirmation bias argument regarding the initials is strong. The possibility of a copycat killer in the third murder is plausible, and the complete lack of a resolution after 50 years of investigation means that every theory, including the multiple killer theory, has to remain on the table. Ultimately, the focus on the pattern and the single killer question can sometimes obscure the real tragedy at the heart of the case. Three little girls had their lives stolen from them. Carmen Colón, Wanda Walkowicz, and Michelle Maenza were not letters in a killer's puzzle. They were children, they had families who loved them, friends they played with, and futures they never got to see. Their parents went to their graves without knowing who killed their daughters. Their siblings grew up under the shadow of an unanswered horror. The alphabet murders left a permanent scar on Rochester. It was a loss of innocence for the entire community. Parents who had let their children walk to the store or play outside unsupervised suddenly locked their doors. The world, which had seemed relatively safe, now held a nameless, faceless monster. The case became a local legend, a ghost story told to remind children of the dangers of talking to strangers. The question of whether it was a single killer is fascinating, and it's the central mystery of the case. But the answer, whatever it may be, wouldn't change the outcome for Carmen, Wanda, and Michelle. It wouldn't bring them back. It would only give a name to the darkness that took them. For now, that darkness remains nameless. The case is cold, but the memory is not. And the question remains hanging in the air over Rochester for half a century. One killer, methodical and patient, who simply vanished. Or a series of terrible coincidences that created a phantom, allowing the real killers to melt back into the crowd. We may never know for sure.